Hello, and welcome to the 21 CSLA Research Webinar. My name is Rebecca Chung, and I'm pleased to welcome you today to our first ever webinar series. Today's webinar will focus on issues of equity and distance learning during this time. But first, a bit about 21 CSLA. The 21 CSLA project is also called the 21st Century School Leadership Academy, and it is dedicated to the professional learning and support of California's educational leaders, teachers, site, and district to create more equitable learning environments that ultimately improve success for underserved students. Headquartered at UC Berkeley Graduate School of Education, it is led in partnership with UCLA School of Education, the California Subject Matter Projects, and 7 regional academies across the state. Special thanks and acknowledgements to the sponsors of 21 CSLA, the California Department of Education, the California State Board of Education, and the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. The 21 CSLA project will be designing webinars over the course of 3 years. The purpose of our webinars is to connect the work of research and practice by engaging scholars and educational leaders through a reciprocal process. We seek to leverage educational research to inform practice and to use practice to inform research. Today's guiding questions for the webinar include: how have leaders responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, and how have schools been shaped as a result of the pandemic? Furthermore, we wonder, what are the emerging implications for equity during this time? I believe that a copy of the slides for today are being loaded into the chat as a file, and so you're welcome to access them through a link if you would like to read along with us. Today's agenda will include a presentation of the National Survey of High School Principals around COVID-19 by Professor John Rogers. Then we will have a panel discussion with panelists from the field. Then we will have a breakout group discussion with the participants, and then we will return for final reflections and thoughts from the participants to our respondent, Professor John Rogers. To start, I'd like to introduce Professor Rogers. John Rogers is a professor at UCLA's Graduate School of Education and Information Studies and director of UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access, otherwise known as IDEA. He also serves as the faculty director of CenterX, which houses UCLA's teacher education program, principal leadership program, and professional development initiatives. Rogers studies the role of civic engagement in equity-focused school reform and civic renewal and the relationship between education and different forms of inequality. He is currently the principal investigator of the Keeping Time Project, which explores the ways that learning time is experienced differently across low-income and affluent communities. Rogers also co-leads the Learning About Inequality project that examines how high schools across North America engage students in lessons about economic, social, and racial inequality. John Rogers is the co-author of Learning Power, Organizing for Education and Justice, and co-editor of Public Engagement for Public Education, Joining Forces to Revitalize Democracy and Equalize School. Please join me in welcoming as our inaugural researcher, Professor John Rogers.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I'm very pleased to join you all, as well as my wonderful colleagues at the California School Leadership Academy. I'm eager to share the findings from my nationally representative survey of high school principals about the transition to remote learning last spring. But I want to begin with a more recent story that comes from interviews I've been conducting the last couple weeks with principals around the country. And before I do that, I'm just going to pause for a second and share screen so I don't forget. Okay. Terrific. Last week, I spoke with an award-winning principal in North Carolina, who I will call Dr. D. Dr. D has been at the helm of her school for 2 decades. She told me, "John, I feel like I'm a first-year principal again." Dr. D went on to explain that almost everything about her job feels unfamiliar, and the difficulties she experiences all seem novel. Many other principals I've interviewed echo Dr. D's words. Dr. K, a veteran principal in Wisconsin, told me, "I find myself continually humbled by these new experiences." To their great credit, Dr. D and Dr. K have risen to the challenge. Every day, they make extraordinary efforts to meet the needs of staff and students. And they treat this moment as an opportunity for learning. Like the best new principals, they act amidst uncertainty, reflect on the fly, adjust, and act again. If they have the courage to learn lessons in this way, so should we all. And in that spirit, let me turn to my study. My colleagues and I at UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access conducted a nationally representative survey with 344 public high school principals in late May and June to understand how schools took up their new role and how learning and student well-being have been affected by COVID-19. As we remember all too well, the closure of school campuses in spring 2020 came with little warning, few resources, and minimal guidance from federal and state officials or professional organizations. Yet principals across the country leaned into this monumental task as health threats and economic dislocation affected staff, community members, and students. As one California principal reported, the transition to remote instruction will go down as one of public education's most incredible feats. Our survey findings highlight public schools' heroic responses in supporting students and sustaining communities in difficult times. But they also point to the ways that long-standing inequalities and challenges to learning have been exacerbated, particularly in schools serving high poverty communities. Let me now briefly walk you through some findings from the survey and share 3 lessons that speak to the role of school leaders. As I do this, I'm going to intersperse the survey data with a few recent clips from high school principals. I will also share some emerging insights from the interviews I've been doing the last couple of weeks. At the end of my presentation, I'm going to ask us all to step back in time and perspective as I call upon John Dewey to help us forge a framework for moving forward in these perilous times. Lesson 1, the best public schools are community schools that connect families to health and social welfare services and foster social trust and understanding. Almost all US high schools delivered meals to students, and more than 2/3 of principals said that their school provided meals to family members of students last spring. Here is Juan Regosa, the principal of Berkeley High School. Oops. Oh, there we go.
John, I'm sorry, we can't hear your video yet.
You know what? Give me 1 second. I think it's possible that I need to set share computer sound. Okay. Does that work? No. That didn't work either. Let me try one more time and then I'll just skip it if it doesn't work. Sure. Oh, it's asking me to share to update my software. So I'm going to skip that for now, and we'll move beyond this slide. Sorry about that. So Juan talked about delivering meals not just to students at the school site, but going out into the community to deliver them in person. In addition to providing meals, schools have met many other needs. Most principals reported that their school helped students and families access and navigate health services. Half of principals reported providing support to students experiencing housing insecurity or homelessness. And sadly, 43% of principals last spring reported providing support for students who experienced death in their families. I strongly suspect that those numbers have grown in the subsequent months. School leaders now should double down on strategies that support student well-being and strengthen relationships with various segments of the community. As one principal told us, the connection between schools, students, and communities will be the key to not only getting back to normal, but coming back better than ever. Principals should conduct inventories of community needs, initiate conversations with community partners, and encourage teachers to engage students in curriculum that examines issues and concerns in their local community. Several principals I recently interviewed refer to their school as a community school, and they mean something more than this, than that their school is a service provider. Miss M in Georgia told me last week that her school has long had a food pantry for students and families. In the midst of the recent economic downturn, some of the families who previously contributed food to the pantry now find themselves out of work and needing that support themselves. So Miss M talks about her school as a community of care in which everyone is looking out for each other. Lesson 2. Providing learning opportunities for all students requires that we address pre-existing and pervasive inequalities. Even as the global pandemic created a set of shared educational challenges, learning in some schools was more adversely affected than in others. For example, schools in middle-class communities were far more likely than schools serving high-poverty communities to have all staff equipped for remote instruction when they closed their doors last spring. Principals also reported great variability in student access to technology hardware and connectivity needed to participate from home. Middle-class schools were 3 times as likely as high-poverty schools to have almost all of their students ready for remote instruction at the time of transition. Our study found that many schools made Herculean efforts to distribute technology to students after the transition to remote instruction, and these efforts narrow the opportunity gap a little. But when we talk to principals in high-poverty communities, we learn that mere access to a tablet or a laptop does not necessarily translate to meaningful opportunities to learn during remote instruction. This next slide was going to be Dr. Cynthia Gonzalez, a wonderful principal in South Los Angeles, who actually leads a school that focuses on technology and whose school was one-to-one before the pandemic. But her iPads were old, and it turned out that the applications on her iPads wouldn't work. And it also was the case is that she found out that her students didn't have the sort of connectivity at home that would allow them to use them. So the digital divide played out despite the fact that her school, in theory, should have been better prepared. Principals in high poverty schools, in addition, found that the distress of economic conditions made it very difficult for their students. Too many students in their schools experienced food insecurity and unstable housing. And this made it very hard for young people to participate meaningfully in school. Principals in high poverty schools were far more likely than their peers to report that large numbers of students were losing touch with students amidst the strains of the pandemic. A principal in one high poverty urban school noted, "My students' lives and well-being have become more and more precarious. There are some social safety nets, but not nearly enough, and the disparity is palpable." Certainly, the primary answer to these challenges lies with federal and state investment in supporting students and families. Principals understand that if we want students to be academically engaged, we must look beyond the classroom to ensure young people have secure food, stable housing, and ready access to healthcare. But beyond these big policy changes, school principals also must act to re-engage disconnected students. In my recent interviews, I've been struck that fewer students are disconnected in schools where principals have established a strong sense of collective identity and purpose through community building efforts. Dr. T, a principal in Illinois, told me, "We are West High. We look out for each other." Of course, such statements sometimes represent empty rhetoric, but Dr. T has established a complex set of practices that foster a deep sense of community amongst her students and staff. Lesson 3. Educators are anxious to get back to in-person learning, but many do not want to return to schools as they were. Strong leaders create conditions for a collective reimagining. A Texas principal spoke for many of her colleagues when she said, "It's hard to go out into the hallways and not see any kids." Yet numerous principals told us that COVID-19 presents an opportunity to reset, reflect on our values and beliefs, shift the way students are taught, or dismantle broken systems. A California principal explained, "Public education has not only changed during this pandemic, but it has caused us to prepare to see a new way of teaching our students forever." Oh, let me go back. So all the principals I've recently interviewed are committed to reimagining teaching and learning in the wake of the pandemic. The strongest principals have already initiated processes that involve various stakeholders. One example of this comes from a racially diverse school in Georgia, where Miss M created a virtual forum last June in which recent graduates talked with her admin team about racial injustices that they had experienced at her school and what might be done different moving forward. We can't afford to lose these powerful ideas for reimagining in the hustle and bustle of reopening schools. Many states and districts have established elaborate rules about social distancing to ensure the safety of students and staff who return to school. In addition to providing sufficient physical space, educators need to foster creative space in which teachers, students, and community members can develop a shared vision for what schools should become. And that brings me to John Dewey. When I'm not studying leadership responses to the pandemic, I'm a scholar of Dewey and democracy. The 3 lessons I've highlighted this afternoon are perhaps best understood within the Deweyan framework of democratic leadership. Dewey articulated this framework most clearly in 2 speeches he gave to administrators in the 1930s. One was called Toward Administrative Statesmanship in 1935, and the other, Democracy and Educational Administration in 1937. These speeches emerge in a period of growing anti-democratic sentiment in Europe and here in the United States. As Dewey wrote, "The fundamental beliefs and practices of democracy are now challenged as they never have been before." Indeed, this article often seems like it was written for our very moment. For Dewey, democracy was something more than a way to organize politics. It was about habits and commitments in everyday life. School leaders, he argued, had a critical role to play in enacting and fostering what he described as democratic methods in all social relationships. Let me share 3 of Dewey's core ideas about democratic leadership that connect to the 3 lessons we've talked about today. First, democratic leadership encourages inclusive participation in decision-making. Dewey told school leaders, "The keynote of democracy as a way of life may be expressed as the necessity of the participation of every mature being in formation of the values that regulate the living of men together." For Dewey, such participation is developmental. We learn as we participate. He explained, "What the argument for democracy implies is that the best way to produce initiative and constructive power is to exercise it. Power as well as interest comes by use and practice." Second, democratic leadership demands a commitment to equality. The idea of inclusive participation both underscores equal regard for all members of the political community and builds a case for why equality of conditions is in everyone's interest. He told the school leaders, each one is equally an individual and entitled to equal opportunity of development or of his or her own capacities. Third, democratic leadership calls on our schools to attend to the holistic development of young people and all facets of community life. We cannot distinguish educational concerns from broader social needs, and we cannot separate service providers from service recipients. For Dewey, we are all part of a cooperative community. He said, the degree to which the administrator achieves the integration of the educational phase of his work with the human and social relations into which he necessarily enters, he will treat the school itself as a cooperative community. John Dewey understood that school principals need to attend to a great deal of routine and detail, but he said an administrator can deal effectively with these various problems only as he is able to unify them all in some comprehensive idea and plan. For Dewey, this idea was democracy. Leadership of, by, and for democracy meant inclusive participation, equality of opportunity, and holistic development in cooperative communities. These ideals can serve as guideposts for principals navigating the many challenges of our present moment. And with that, let me make a non-commercial announcement, which is that this Thursday, my colleagues and I from UC Riverside will be releasing a new report arguing that it's important for California public schools to reclaim their democratic purpose. So kind of bringing together this idea of democracy. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Rebecca and so that we can have a broader discussion on some of these ideas.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and we also will put a link in the chat to the full report for those of you who might be interested in accessing the full report that was released in September, as well as the California data that was produced as a part of that report. Now we're going to invite a panel of practitioners to join us. And I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to engage in a dialogue about some of the topics that were discussed and also how they might apply to our current reality now 8 months into this pandemic. First, it's my pleasure to introduce Margaret Arthofer, who currently serves as coordinator at the Sacramento County Office of Education, who is one of the regional academy partners of the 21 CSLA. An educator with over 30 years of experience, Margaret has worked in schools across California, including Ventura and Shasta County, as a teacher, principal, and director. Most recently, Margaret joined SCOE after working at the Association for California School Administrators, otherwise known as ACSA. Thank you for being here today, Margaret. Next, I'd like to introduce Darrington Ramsey, who currently serves as the Director of Accountability and Continuous Improvement at the Ventura County Office of Education, and he has served as the Region 8 Director of District and School Support. One of Darrington's many responsibilities is to serve as the project lead for 21 CSLA. In addition, he has served as an elementary secondary site leader, as well as a district and state level administrator. Thank you for being here today. And finally, I would like to welcome Francis Rojas, who is in his 4th year as a principal of Milpitas High School, a diverse and comprehensive high school serving over 3,000 students in the Silicon Valley. He is a former science teacher and student activities director and a proud graduate of UC Berkeley's Principal Leadership Institute. Welcome, Francis, and thank you for being here today. All right, so we have a series of 3 questions that we're going to use as a starting place to engage in a conversation about the research that we have heard today, as well as how it relates to the everyday experience of school leaders in California. First question has to do with lesson number 2. that Dr. Rogers raised around conditions for reimagining that are in a result of how schools address issues of structural inequality. What is the role of leaders in working with communities to address structural inequality? What can leaders do?
So I'll jump in. Hello, everyone. So I think we'll start with sort of identifying what a structural inequality might be. And so that speaks to the institutional practices and arrangements that lead to these inequities. And an example of an inequity or structural inequity that I would identify would be the way in which the LCFF, the local control funding formula, plus our LCAP processes really focus on stakeholder engagement, but don't necessarily include the idea that we should center particular marginalized and under-resourced groups as the way that we go about either engaging with those stakeholders. And an example of that would be the time that the meetings are held, where they're being held, and also, as I said before, the centering of those particular marginalized groups. So I think the role of the leader is that first thing, to center those marginalized, under-resourced students and families and communities, but also to identify where those structural inequities may be. And then lastly, sort of design, implement, and evaluate whatever particular strategies they're putting in place to ensure that that student group, that community, that family has been centered and also has been benefited from whatever that particular strategy might be. The way that I connect this to Professor Rogers' research is that he talks about expanding student access to technology. And I think the implication there is that there was funding available and that someone had engaged in some sort of empathy interview process to understand where those Wi-Fi's, hotspots, laptops, devices may have needed to be shared with students, families, and whether they're actually able to use those back in their home context. So I'll stop there and just give some space for my colleagues.
I'd like to tag along on what Darrington said. I mean, that example of technology. I had a conversation with some of my colleagues over the last couple of months is, okay, did it take a pandemic to make sure that all of our students had access to Chromebooks, to hotspots? Where did this all come from? My previous district had one-to-one for an even larger high school. We were close to one-to-one, but it wasn't until this pandemic that those resources were reallocated for student use. So I think as school leaders, we are all change agents of the systems that we participate in, but we are also advocates for the students who are struggling the most. So Darrington, you spoke about centering our focus on the marginalized student, the marginalized families. The students and families who need the most are the ones who are going to be able to lift us all up together. And so I really believe as school leaders, we need to rise above those structural and institutional barriers that maybe prevented us from saying, hey, we should give all this technology right now, that it didn't take a pandemic. So I want to pose this question, how do we ensure that those structural inequities and those barriers we don't revert back to that type of mentality and approach to our resources, especially now that have more local control of our funding through LCFF?
I'd like to address the role of the leader as it works and the responsibility to work with the stakeholders around setting goals around those structural inequalities and to build a community of collaboration and continuous improvement in order to address that. Oftentimes, whether we're a teacher, a site, a leader, a central office leader, or a leader in the community of another agency, we often work in silos. So what happens is you have the education system that is in some ways doing what we do in education, but we're not necessarily always in sync with, for example, social services or health services or public safety. So, or even within a district, you can have a district office that has business services, special education, human resources, curriculum and instruction, accountability personnel that all have the same goal, but they have competing priorities. So it's about breaking down those silos, and the leaders must they must help to build and foster relationships in order to do so. Um, because until that happens, we're not going to be able to have that united goal and then really focus all of our resources and our time to address that around structural inequalities, whether it's individual devices or Wi-Fi. It's all part of a bigger picture.
I'm struck by the fact that part of what the leader's role is to clarify for their own school community and for the broader public the meaning of ideas like equality. Dewey told us that we need to focus on equal opportunity because it's essential to develop the full capacity of every member of our school community, right? So even if we have the veneer of equality, even if every student has a device, but they can't meaningfully use that device, we don't have equality in the sense that every young person is able to fully develop their capacity. The role of the principal is to clarify that concept and then to help the public understand the ways in which equality needs to be enacted at the local level, and we need to take account of that local set of local contextual factors that determine whether or not that equality is at the veneer level or if it's meaningful and deep.
Are there other examples of structural inequality that anyone would like to discuss outside of technology? I heard in the research summary, of course, issues of access to food, issues of health, issues of mental health needs, physical health needs, and well-being needs. Is there someone who'd like to address another area from their perspective?
I will touch on that just briefly. We know that there are some students that truly need wraparound services, and they are not always available to them. And so it's about connecting those students within those other systems. And sometimes that's bringing them to the schools. Some communities, some districts, some schools with the lower poverty, socioeconomic, they don't have those same challenges. In some ways, they don't necessarily need those basic needs met. Food, think about Maslow's hierarchy. They know where their dinner is going to come from every single day. And then you have others where they don't know that. And so in a lot of ways, sometimes that's put upon the school to help figure out how to connect all of those. That's an example. Food, social services, mental health services, all of those.
I would just add that, you know, we talked about health services and social services, but I would also offer that the way in which governance is conducted within our education system provides a structural inequality. And the example that I'll give is the way in which parents and communities participate from a stakeholder standpoint typically is reflected at the district level in something like a DLAC, right? And then at the school level, it's reflected as a school site council. But in order to participate in these particular groups, you have to be able to participate in the meeting, right? You have to be able to physically be there. You also have to show up with some level of understanding of the ways in which sort of Title III funding comes to the school district and the rules and regulations that govern that. And what I would offer in short is that the families who are coming from the most marginalized, under-resourced, and underserved communities are typically outside of those particular structures, those systems that would give them sort of that mindset, that knowledge base to then be able to come in and fully participate in those funding and allocating of resources sort of decision-making processes. And so that continues to sort of perpetuate an inequity when those particular processes don't have a leader who has a particular mindset where they're, again, centering those underserved communities and then adjusting for that beyond that particular stakeholder process, but across the years.
I definitely think what's been a blessing, at least in my district and in my high school, is the presence of community liaisons and social workers. You know, my school is not a Title I school. We only have about 35% free reduced lunch, but that doesn't mean that there are students and families that are in need. And what really happened when this pandemic came about is that suddenly school wasn't the place that a student could come to every day to receive what they need to survive every day. Just because we're 35% doesn't mean that maybe that we're beyond the 50% doesn't mean that there is that need. So we've been blessed to have that type of leadership where I, as a principal, can lean on certain individuals to make sure we are connected with every family and that they receive the services. So this idea of wraparound community schools used to be only connected with Title I schools or schools with high free and reduced lunch numbers. But now we need to think at every school, how do we have a component of that wraparound service, whether it be through your district, through schooling services at the county levels, that are easily accessible for principals to connect families to those services and resources. Because like we say, the learning won't happen if you're struggling at home trying to just survive.
Francis, let me pick up on that just really quickly and note that in some European countries, community schools are schools that are serving across socioeconomic levels. They are embodying this idea that Dewey first articulated in 1902 of the school as a social center, in which schools aren't just providing services, they're also spaces for the civic development of all members of the community so that they can then act and speak out in robust ways about issues that matter to them. One of the hopeful signs I think we see during the pandemic is that many principals are reporting parents are participating in ways that they previously have not, because what we may have previously perceived as a lack of interest turns out to be a lack of parking. And so parents now are participating. There's new opportunities. We need to take advantage of that and build upon that as we move forward.
And this really leads into our second discussion question, which is tied to the first lesson learned from Professor Rogers' study around community schools. The best schools are centers of community. They're communities of care. Specifically thinking about issues of working with partners, parents, and teachers to rethink teaching and learning. In some ways, this distance learning period has opened the black box of the classroom to families and in new ways. And we're interested in hearing any thoughts that you might have or examples you might have from the field of how schools and leaders are working with partners, parents, and teachers to rethink teaching and learning during this time.
I think I'd like to start on that. I think the key word is collective. What this pandemic has done was physically separated us. I think it was maybe March 16th. It was either the 13th or the 16th. We were cut off. I'm a principal, like, okay, all I have is email. That's all I have. How am I going to connect to my community? And a couple of strategies that have worked is really it's really centered around collectivism. How do we gather to discuss the needs, the resources, the challenges, the highlights, and using different affinity groups, whether it be, I find myself taking a lot of solace and enjoy meeting with principals from other districts every 2 weeks in my county. We had never met before about this, but we're putting our minds together, collective, cooperative and collaborative groups with more frequent virtual meetings in this case. But some of the strategies have really been around creating new groups and having them meet more frequently, and then taking those groups and making sure there's representatives from different stakeholders and having that information come together. Also surveying parents, students, and staff, doing temperature reads frequently, maybe once every month or two, just to see how things are going. Again, it's that lack of physical gathering. I mean, schools are, like we said, it's a center of the community. It's a place where everyone was going, and now we're not physically together. So the strategy to me that's been really important is how do you create those collective gatherings around different topics so information can be shared, input can be taken, feedback, collaboration, and cooperation between the different groups.
Thank you. Is there someone else who'd like to weigh in on examples or strategies around how leaders can collectively work with parents, partners, and teachers to think about reimagining teaching and learning?
I'll jump in. One of the things that I'd like to share is as an example, I'm working with the principal and she's currently trying to roll out what she's entitling equity initiatives on our campus. And sort of the background for that is that this is a charter school where it's predominantly populated by students that are white and of students who are from the Latinx sort of background or culture, right? And so, but within that school, there's a very small community of African American students. And one of the ways, and when we talk about community schools, right, it's implied that what that community really means is relationship, right? That you're in relationship with your community so that the decision-making processes, the planning processes are reflective of that. And so the example that I'll share in terms of community schools and how that's playing out within COVID, this principal decided that she was going to start supporting her teachers in training around culturally sustaining pedagogies. And that wasn't something, some people say culturally relevant teaching, you know, it's labeled a lot of things, but she decided that that was something she was going to do. And I think it was a direct result of sort of the social pandemic or epidemic, you know, that occurred after George Floyd. There's a longer conversation to be had about that. But I feel like the African American community members, and it wasn't just African Americans that were impacted by this, that's not what I'm implying. But in this example, they felt a little bit more seen. And so they showed up to the school, she had conversations with them. And as a result, she adopted a curriculum that's rooted in hip hop. And there's a longer conversation to be had about that. But that decision was based on the fact that those community members showed up, they were seen, they were respected, and there were resources allocated to address their concerns with the intention of helping high-level learning for their students, in particular, their African-American student population. And I don't mean to imply that hip hop is the only way for that. I'm just giving you the example that that's the way that it played out.
I like your example. I'm thinking of a couple of different areas, and one is something that there's a group throughout California called the Labor Management Initiative that was originally started to have both the management and the labor, the union, come together to focus on particular areas so they had set the same goals. And they had not always come around agreements in that particular way. But they have a set of protocols in place, frameworks for collaboration, how to develop trust among the stakeholders, how to invite people in to respond. So if the question was, what are strategies that are undertaken? I think that they have some wonderful strategies that can be shared and learned from. Another one is what we're doing in CSLI is, you know, the communities of practice is what around a particular shared passion. Those communities can be made up of anybody and everybody that has that same passion, where they share resources, they try ideas, that they support each other, they really connect on multiple levels. And I don't see why we couldn't develop those that had not just parents, we talk about parents, but to include students, and to reach out to those students that are the silent students, the ones that we don't hear from, the ones that have shied away, because they have ways that they prefer to learn. And we should be talking to them as well as their parents, as well as teachers, as well as administrators, and combining that research with what works for kids.
You know, I want to give some praise to LMI, to Labor Management Initiative. That is a model that our district took around making decisions around our fall schedule, how we're going to reopen. We employed a variety of different task forces that were made up of students, parents, teachers, staff, administrators, classified staff and administrators. And that's really come a long way, because when it came down to really let the community, this is the direction we're going, the buy-in was already there. It's because of those protocols and procedures of how everyone had a voice, they were listened to, even though might not be the way you want it, your voice was heard and we could move forward. So I do want to also highlight LMI as a resource to come together and bring stakeholders together around some decision making during this time.
So Francis, I think that connects to the fact as we think about relationship building and community building, a lot of folks right now are bemoaning the fact that we don't have the sorts of informal opportunities to connect with one another, whether it's with students or parents or teachers. And it's absolutely the case that we don't have those informal opportunities. But at the same time, there's something about the formality of a Zoom context that allows for more procedural engagement to occur. And I think that as we move forward, the opportunities to play off the informal and formal forms of engagement will allow for the sorts of deep social relationships of trust to emerge. And so we may be at a moment now where we have to build upon the formal, and then we can move into the more informal context as we move back into school.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I think about is my school site council meeting. I have higher participation in school site council meetings now that it's on Zoom compared to when it was in person in my library once a month. And I think it's because now that everyone has technology and hotspots, even parents are hopping on and saying, hey, I can say something at that meeting, even if I just hop on. And it's an open invitation. You click on the link, you see all these other parents, and you see the topics, and you say something. So it's become less formal in a sense, because you actually don't have to show up. You just have to be there really quick. So I don't think I'd ever return to an in-person school site council meeting as long as I'm a principal. I don't see any purpose of doing that. And it gets me thinking about moving forward, what are some of these systems and approaches and strategies, do we modify moving forward? Why go back to something that wasn't working and is actually getting more voices in? So I think those are some questions that school leaders have. We hear about a vaccine coming around. We're all in reopening planning. Most of California has moved a step or two back on the health levels. So it makes us really wonder, what do we keep when we move forward?
One of the things that I would add to that is that, and this isn't intended to go political one way or the other, but I think we should recognize that Proposition 15 and Proposition 16 failed here in California. And the way in which I connect that is that, right, our voting process is our public's voice, right? The way in which they engage our democracy is by having a vote, and then that being sort of representative of who they are, how they think, and sort of decisions that they would expect to be made. So one of the things that I think is an implication, Francis, as you talk about more participation in school site council as a governance structure, would be, are principals and leaders prepared for this new level of engagement from those communities who may have been misconstrued, as Professor Rogers talked about, uninterested, undervaluing education? Are they prepared to engage with these particular stakeholders in a meaningful, respectful, and affirming manner? And what I would offer is that some may be and some may not be. And so thinking about the way in which we prepare principals, the way in which we as individual leaders engage in developing our own mindset around who they are, understanding that we may be carrying unconscious biases and all of those things, all of those seem to be implications for this work going forward, especially because we definitely want to continue the participation of our marginalized groups and our marginalized communities into this education system that we have here in California.
Can I pick up on that point really quick? I'll just make this really quick, that what we need is opportunities for principals to practice. In a different study, we saw that the single factor that was most predictive of whether or not principals promoted democratic education in their school wasn't their ideology, wasn't the politics of the surrounding community. It was whether those principals themselves regularly had discussions with friends and family about social and political life, and whether they participated in efforts to improve their own community. We need to open up space for principals to practice that, to practice having difficult conversations about race and inequality as well, if we want them to be able to lead those conversations in the broader community.
And if I can just add, in addition to my professional role, I'm the parent of an English learner. And I think that it's important for us to think about how there are groups that are really struggling with the format in terms of technology. And while there may be more access for some, there could be reduced access for others. And I think one of the roles of leaders is to continually attend to when a context helps engage groups and also maybe unintentionally excludes other groups. And so how we think about those dynamics becomes an important part of being a leader for equity. Is there anyone else who'd like to add anything to that idea?
I think that's a perfect point, Professor Chung or Rebecca. And what I would share there is that one of the questions that we ask in continuous improvement is what's working for whom and under what conditions. And I think as leaders, we have to spend time, once we've planned and we've implemented, we have to make sure that we don't forget that last piece, which is evaluation, focusing on the outcomes, and then spending some time reflecting and continuing in that sort of, as we know, continued cycle of improvement. And so I think it's important that we as leaders really pay attention to the full process versus we did the empathy interviews, we were able to use that information in planning and designing, but then once the implementation happens, we kind of fall off to really understand whether it worked for that particular group or multiple groups that we were intending for that particular process, legislation, or whatever it may have been, to successfully and productively support that.
So that actually ties directly into our last question. We only have 5 more minutes for our panelist discussion, and then we're going to be moving you as participants into breakout rooms to get your ideas. So you have someone to talk to about what might have been catalyzed in your mind during this conversation. And the last question is about policy, of course, about policy measures that might need to be made at the state level to tackle some of these inequalities, especially ones that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. I raised the issue of English learners, but certainly in the news, we've had a lot of discussion about special education students, homeless students, and so forth. And so I'd love to hear some thoughts you have for policies, new policies, renewed policies, reimagined policies that we may need as a result of the pandemic.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the digital divide and what happened early on. And, having read the report and seeing what happened throughout the United States, we lost so much time with students because of their inability to either have connectivity or hardware. And in California, we are so fortunate to have some very tech giants. And to me, they are our partner. And I feel that there could be some way that our state agencies could possibly partner with some of those to make sure that students have hotspots, that we're not having our principals down in the schools copying packets to hand off instead of helping their teachers. The other thing that I always think of when it comes to policy, oftentimes policies are just in general created, thinking about mid to large size districts and what happens when you have small districts. And there are about 1,100 districts in California, of which half of them are categorized as small school districts. So they have 2,500 students or less. So that means that every policy that is put in place, you have a limited number of people at the central office that can help to support that. And so my thought would be that any policies that are created to recognize that not only the student populations, but the district's ability to be able to provide, to do whatever the policy is, that one size does not fit all. And that would be a hope that I would like them to consider. And then because we only have a few minutes left, I will stop and let my colleagues join.
You know, the same idea was coming to mind. Some of the work that I've been doing here in Milpitas, you know, together with our school board and superintendent, we've created this alliance called Milpitas Alliance Partners for a Future Ready Workforce. It was really connecting us with the local high-tech companies and industries here in the Silicon Valley to provide mentorships, resources, that sort of thing around career technical education. When the pandemic hit, that group actually was quite inviting of us to create. We did this almost like speed dating format meeting where representatives from companies met with principals, and we said, this is our greatest need, and they came through. And so if that can be done on a local level, and I know it's a unique bubble here in Silicon Valley with all those resources, how does the state play a role in creating that type of relationship statewide? If I think about rural districts or small districts or districts that are really in like old industry, not the new like shiny, glittery stuff that the economy always talks about, how do we spread that wealth through the state with those approaches? Because these companies have a lot to give, but we're not tapping into them. Prop 15 was an attempt to do it, but that didn't push through this time around. And so what type of policies allow that type of sharing of resources or take corporate responsibility onto the educational system in the state of California?
I think the one thing I would add, Francis, to connect with what you were just sharing is this idea of the way in which policy can shield the most needy, or I shouldn't say needy, but under-resourced schools, school districts, and communities. We know that Prop 89 is primarily the way that we fund our schools and our school districts, and we know that 2% of the funding comes from the federal government. Some of us may have had the opportunity to read about some of the debacle that was going around ESSER funding and CARES funding and that sort of thing. So for me, the policy sort of next step might be, how do we think about not only what's happening now in terms of the economic issues that our marginalized and under-resourced communities are experiencing now as a result of COVID-19, but for those of us that really remember just 12 years ago, 2008, the recession also had a huge impact on the coffers for school funding. And so I was reading a report the other day by WestEd, and it's old. It's called The Silent Recession. And what it talks about is the adequacy of the LCFF funding, but the challenges that school districts were having around health costs, around aging facilities, around declining enrollment. All of those didn't go away because COVID-19 showed up. It's a larger topic. People are focused on it. So I think part of the policy that folks should be focusing on, or policymakers should be focusing on, is how do we hold steady the funding streams and revenues that our school districts expected to receive going into this fiscal year and going forward, so that it's not as much of a detriment to the way in which supports and services are provided to all of our students, but especially those students that are coming from under-resourced and underserved communities.
Jared, and I had a very similar comment as well, considering that most districts, their entire budget, 85% is made up of their expenditures or personnel. That leaves only 15% of their budget to keep the utilities, maintenance, supplies, and everything else going. And then you have something like the pandemic where all of a sudden they're having to, just the custodial cost to clean and sanitize rooms, and then the process in which all the protective gear that they needed to get in to start to go back to hybrid or in person has created this tremendous extra expense with very little wiggle room. So even though the policies are not, they're not bad, but the fact is that how do we afford them and don't end up with all of the deferrals and the layoffs in that cycle all over again? So
And
yes,
I would add too that we're not going to have more equitable policies at the state level until we have fundamentally more inclusive politics, until all of the communities across California are fully represented in the making of our laws. Our virtual moment creates opportunities for that to occur. We can connect young people to state legislators in ways that we haven't really thought about before. We just need to take advantage of this virtual moment to remake our politics.
And with that, let's move to a breakout room discussion for our participants. Now, I know some of you don't like breakout room discussions, but please indulge us. We want to hear from you. We want your input. And we're asking you to discuss in your breakout rooms how schools can foster the process of reimagination, attending to inclusion and equity. And so please bring back the researcher for today. Okay, so we're adding a few of our thoughts from our breakout rooms in the chat. We had a really rich discussion in our breakout room. I hope that some of the folks from our breakout room will add their thoughts. I can start as people are writing in the chat. I'll just say, Professor Rogers, that one question that came up and one thought we had was, what is the process for reimagining? We talked a lot about the assumptions we make when we ask people to reimagine and what processes they might have to go through in order to engage in reimagining. Like, do we have to recognize our own, the ways that our own thinking has been influenced by the current system? And do we need to be able to interrogate our own values and assumptions as educators and as leaders in order to engage in the reimagining process? I also see a lot of comments coming in the chat about an opportunity, that this pandemic does provide an opportunity. It also requires strategy. And how can leaders be strategic when they are attending to many of the emergencies of the current time, whether it's substituting in classrooms, whether there aren't teachers, or whether there are emergencies, and how they attend to both of those things. So I'll keep looking for themes, but I just wanted to mention those as opening themes in case you'd like to start the reflection process. I'm sorry, we need to make sure you're.
I'm struck by that question about what are the preconditions in effect for reimagining. And I think that one of the preconditions that principals need to establish is a recognition that we are coming to this reimagining with a diverse set of histories, that many in any given school community will have reasons not to trust that this process of reimagining will be fully inclusive, will serve their interests well. Because schools in the democratic process often have been exclusionary, often have privileged certain voices over others. And so I think that grounding in his history is important. That naming of that history is important. I think acknowledging the diversity of perspectives that are coming into the process also seems really important, and having some first steps being the naming of those assumptions seems really important. And then finally, it strikes me that offering up opportunities for people to articulate their visions of the possible, their visions of what learning can be when it is transformative, so that we don't just reproduce what has gone on in the past. I know I've often initiated community meetings by asking people to think about the time in their schooling when they felt most creative, or the time in their schooling where they experienced a sense of power that was unusual, right? So opening up space for that sense of the transformative possibility of teaching and learning, I think, is critical to this reimagining. So it's not just about reproducing what we already have done.
Go ahead.
I was just a question that came up somewhat in our group and somewhat from what you said, Rebecca, as well, is the necessity for some level of stability to afford opportunities for these discussions to be really about learning. My sense from discussions with principals in the last couple months, and then the interviews I've been doing over the last 2 weeks, is that a big source of frustration is they feel whipsawed, that district officials are trying to keep as much flexibility open as possible. And so they're saying, we want you to go plan for X, Y, and Z, even though principals know that these eventualities are not likely to occur. And principals and people at the school are not really being involved in the decisions, and hence there's just too much tumult and not enough stability to support meaningful conversations that will allow people to really participate in this learning process in an authentic way. And I'm just curious for those, for our participants here, would it be better for the principals, for either you as a principal or for the principals that you're working with, if district officials offered a clearer sense at this moment of where things were going to be in the next few months, rather than trying to hold on to as much flexibility as possible?
Connected to your comment, if we can close on these 2 points, I just want to say that for me, as the director of 21 CSLA today, my biggest takeaway from this discussion is the very important role of those agencies and institutions that are supporting our site leaders. In other words, we need to not complicate their lives, but yet help them to be able to reimagine. It is, in fact, our space and privilege to have the opportunity to engage in these types of discussions. And what would it look like for us to put leaders, site leaders, at the center of our work and situate ourselves underneath them, to situate ourselves in support? Maybe a principal who's substituting for a teacher could get relief by someone else substituting as a teacher. It doesn't have to be the principal. There's many of us who could fall into those roles, so that the principal could have some relief to think about what needs to be done at their school. So I guess what I'm saying is inverting the hierarchies of how we think about the roles of districts, counties, policymakers, even universities in this time, and how we center our schools and uplift them as the center and most important part, one of the most important institutions in our community during this pandemic. Thank you so much, Professor Rogers, for joining us in today's inaugural research webinar. I want to thank all of our panelists for taking the time out of their incredibly busy schedules during this period for engaging with us. And just so you know, there will be more, and we hope that you will join us again. Our next research webinar will be on equity and continuous improvement, how we braid two very important leadership strategies for improving our schools. And we have our website available for you and our mailing list if you'd like to get more information. Finally, if you have the time, we encourage you to give us some feedback. This is our inaugural research webinar, and we're very much interested in your feedback. If it's not helping you, we should change our practice. And we can have our own coffee table discussions anytime. We're here to serve you, and so we need your feedback in order to make sure that we're meeting your needs. Thank you again, and I wish you a restful Thanksgiving holiday.